Hey there, thank you for tuning in to the eLearning Champion Pod. It's so good to have you back for our second episode today, and thank you all for all of your appreciation for our previous episode. If this is your first time here, well, a hearty welcome to you. I'm your host UK, and this is the eLearning Champion Pod. This is your home to everything e-learning. Here, we discuss the ins and outs, burst various myths, and basically keep you on par with the e-learning world out there. Your success matters to us, and that's why we give you what matters to you. That being said, welcome to the second episode, and today we'll be talking about setting up a robust learning strategy and ecosystem to ensure that you can tackle the challenge of rapid employee upskilling and reskilling, which is the number one priority of organizations globally today. You will all praise for the speaker we had in a previous episode, hence we had to get her back. Yes, you heard that correct. We got Shalini Megru joining us back for our second episode today. Welcome back, Shalini. It's great to have you again.
Thank you, Abid. It's a pleasure to be here again, and I can't wait to get started.
Likewise. Well, before we get into the topic, let me just give a brief introduction about you to our audience here. Shalini is a versatile learning design professional with over 16 years of experience in instructional design, including instructor led training, virtual instructor led training, and e learning. She's an expert in customer training, consulting, designing, learning, and user assistance solutions. All that and still counting, she's got great hands on experience in this domain, and that is exactly why she's the best fit to talk on this topic. All right, so in the previous episode, we talked at length about how learning and business goals go hand in hand and how important it is for all the business to incorporate these strategies into their work by ensuring our learning initiatives flow out of our organization's business goals. So, today, let's dive into the topic of where do we begin once we have the basic alignment in place. So, let's start from the base. Um, Shiny, what would you say are the next steps once we ensure our desired organizational results, desired performance, and performance-based learning objectives are all aligned? Is it now a matter of designing and developing the required learning experiences, or is there anything else we need to have in place before we dive into execution?
That's a good question, Ubaid. And typically, we tend to dive right into the execution of specific learning experiences based on, of course, this preliminary step of being aligned with business outcomes and strategy. But before going into the granular level, it's important we set the broader framework in terms of formulating a learning strategy and setting up the entire learning ecosystem. So I'd like to borrow a very interesting framework called the Academy's framework from McKinsey to help us see how we can do this. This framework is a tool to conceptualize learning strategy, and it also touches upon all the various pieces of the learning ecosystem. So there are essentially nine components, and I'll quickly touch on each of them.
Okay.
The first one is, to go back to our previous episode podcast. We
Yeah.
started with the business goals, and the first one really is, a continuation. It's the alignment with business strategy. We saw this at the last podcast. While every leader acknowledges that it's very vital for the L&D function to be aligned with business strategy, only 40% of organizations that were polled said that their L&D was aligned. So this is critical because, if your business strategy is, say, digital transformation, then that is the area where L&D needs to step in to provide capabilities and build those specific skill sets in the workforce so that the business strategy or business goal of achieving digital transformation is met.
That's right. So as you know, businesses are always changing, and the priorities of yesterday may not be relevant ones today. This surely has an impact on learning strategies. Can you share any example of changing business strategy being reflected in the learning strategy?
Yeah, Ved, that's a very pertinent point that you've raised here. And you are absolutely right in saying that, uh, these things are in a constant state of flux. And we can't,
Right.
once we have clarity on the business outcomes and the business desired organizational results, we can't just sit back, because a lot of times, because of the kind of agile environment we are in, businesses have to recalibrate and rethink at very frequently. And what you said about this having an impact on learning strategies is very relevant, very true. And I'd like to share a recent example. You know, in our experience of working with one of our top customers, in the light
Mm-hmm.
of a reorganization, a restructuring, it was essential for their teams to collaborate differently than how they were doing it earlier. So, with this increased focus on collaboration, part of the learning strategy involved setting up a collaborative platform where learners could finish their learning and also
Mm-hmm.
engage with each other through group boards. So, all the learners were slotted into groups within the platform and could share insights and comment on each other's posts. All of this within the context of their learning experience. So, the learning strategy included social learning, and this was, of course, a collaborative aspect, and it was entirely aligned with the business strategy of purposeful collaboration that this customer had defined, in the light of
That's
this
good. Yeah.
reorg.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's very practical. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the second component of this framework that I mentioned is co-ownership between business units and HR,
Okay.
co-ownership of the learning academy, the learning function.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is something that we've seen increasingly happen in the last couple of years. And to drive the best possible results, it's very important for L&D to establish a framework, in which business leaders and leaders in HR can come together and drive the prioritization of learning, the overall strategy, right down to the budgets and securing the required funding. With this co owned initiative between the business units and HR, there's more skin in the game, so to speak.
Oh, I'll just have one more question over here. What would you say are the tangible ways in which we can facilitate co-ownership of business units with the HR?
Well, to begin with, instead of having conversations in silos, with business leaders
Uh-huh.
and with HR, we can bring everyone together as equally invested stakeholders. One
Mm.
aspect of the learning strategy is activating the business leaders. For an ecosystem, a learning ecosystem to flourish, the involvement of business leaders is key. So we can work with business units, the leaders of business units, and HR to ensure
Uh-huh.
that together we create a robust learning culture. But I'd like to talk more on this later.
Sure.
But I'll just, another aspect of this is of this co-ownership is that leaders and HR can together lead by example and role modeling. And this is where L&D can play a critical role through their recommendations, through their valuable inputs, through their toolkits that they can set up. And they can also work with leaders in business units and HR to set up credentials for learners, both external and internal. As you know, this is a very important aspect of motivating learners and getting their engagement and buy in. So this is where, we can really actively partner and make sure that everybody is at the same, we're all conversing from the same platform to drive meaningful outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Another important component of this learning strategy and the learning of, ecosystem is assessing the capability gaps. Now, a lot of L&D interventions, of course, do start with the intention of bridging a skill gap. However, one piece that typically goes missing in a lot of places is that of the current capability level. Uh, we do assess this in various ways, but what we really do need is a very formal competency framework so that we can gauge the current competency level. So that is a very important piece, because unless we have this in place, taking people's job roles and their current responsibilities and mapping them to the skill sets, mapping where they stand, and then seeing where they need to be, it is only once we do this, can we go on to the next step of how this capability gap can be addressed through learning interventions? So, this is something where there is increasing focus, and there needs to be a very robust competency mapping model in place for this to happen. Sometimes, you may need to build a new set of skills in existing employees because of a change in the way the business is organized. I mentioned this example of the restructuring that necessitated a
Right.
complete rethinking of the learning strategy, and of to be able to assess the competency gaps and to see what are the impacts. We drove a lot of conversations with business leaders to see what are the impacts on various aspects for various key teams, in the light of this structure restructuring and reorg. Now, the impact mapping is not necessarily something that can be leveraged only during key game changers like reorgs and restructuring, but this is something which, as we can leverage in principle to see, how we can map people's jobs, their tasks, their responsibilities to the specific skill sets and capabilities that we are trying to drive.
Right. To add to what you shared just now, with people shifting into new roles or new people being hired, there are bound to be a lot of upskilling and reskilling requirements. And as a result, plenty of learning programs line up for them. So, how do you make sure the learner has a cohesive, meaningful experience rather than feeling that they have been hit by a flood of different learnings?
Yeah, that's a good question, Obed. And I think we've all had been at the receiving end of a flood of training initiatives at some point or the other in our careers.
Yeah,
And we surely don't want our learners undergoing a similar experience. So,
right,
one good way to ensure that this doesn't happen is to design relevant, meaningful learning journeys. I think by now all of us know for sure that there is no one size fits all approach. And the increasing number of formats available for training, the increasing number of platforms, all of these are various variables, all of these are various things that we need to factor for in this mix. So it's very vital that we design learning journeys that are personalized to learner groups, if not to learners, specific learners. So that is something that addresses, learning journeys are something that address learning as a continuous learning process, and, not how we used to sometimes look at them as standard, standalone, one off events. And now there is a lot of investment being made in making sure that at every stage in the learning journey, the learner is supported with the required learning and intervention, or, with the required learning resources. So, creating pathways for learning really is very critical for the success of whatever we are trying to achieve in terms of learning. One way to do this is to come up with role specific learning journeys and give learners the big picture. It's very important that learners have visibility into what is lined up for them, not just in the immediate present, but in the months to come. Because this visibility is something that gives them, you know, um, the entire big picture, as I mentioned earlier, and is likely to get more buy-in because then they can start planning and they can start anticipating what is to come. And it also adds as a motivation for them to finish their the currently lined up learning experiences so that they are well prepared for what is coming up ahead. So one thing I'd like to mention at this point is that we have leveraged blended learning extensively for creating these role specific learning journeys. And of course, with AI, which has really changed the face of learning, we can leverage it to create and deploy very valuable learning resources. But then, as I mentioned earlier, more on these aspects in our upcoming podcasts. I'd like to touch on a few more points about these learning journeys. It's very important that not only do we as L&D professionals set up and design these learning journeys and make sure that learners have visibility into them, but we also need to make sure that we are enabling learning by letting managers by equipping lab managers with tips on how they can help their teams undertake these learning journeys. One way is to let managers know that they need to help their team members with their work schedules so that their learners and their teams can make time for learning journeys. Some
Mhm.
organizations, of course, give a dedicated 1 hour every week just for learning opportunities. And another way we can really make sure that these learning journeys are weaved in meaningfully in the
Mhm.
flow of work is leaders and managers can make use of every available touch points with their teams and role model their own learning, share aspects of their own learning. And one interesting example I'd like to share about leveraging learning journeys is to not just use them to build technical expertise, but also use the various pieces in these learning journeys to touch on the other broader areas of soft skills. We did this for one of our customers. We built in aspects of collaboration, business etiquette, because this their engagement required collaborating with teams spread across geographies in new ways, and also exploring brand portfolios in these various geographies. So we made it very interesting by also weaving, gamification and a cultural aspect throughout these learners' learning journeys. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's important for us to equip managers also to support their to support their learners, I'm sorry, in their learning journeys.
Mhm.
And we did this by, creating manager toolkits which would give managers very handy tips on how they could support their learners before the start of their learning journeys, during the learning journeys, and after the learning journeys. So we gave them very useful information on what they can say, what they can do, what they can ask, and so on. And these toolkits, such toolkits can become an integral part of how to use managers to build a learning culture, which is also one of the aspects of, making sure that the learning ecosystem is thriving. Um, Another
Yeah.
best practice is, also to act. Learning journeys by definition are something long term. They are a plan. They're a roadmap for the future, and it's very important to at regular intervals act on the feedback that we have been receiving from learners and managers, and also take mid course corrections as and when required. For instance, to share a recent example, when we realized that learners were being overwhelmed, they were feeling a little bit overwhelmed in the light of the reorg and the restructuring and a lot of new things that they had to learn. We paused. We set up a pause in the learning journeys and gave learners the opportunity of using catch up weeks, where pending learning experiences uh, could be completed in time, so that learners didn't feel they were lagging behind. So this is something where when we have an ecosystem where various pieces are all impacting one another and informing one another, then we really ensure that the chances of success go up.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's very thoughtful and intellectual initiative, I would say, which is nice. Yeah.
Now,
So
as I mentioned, sorry, Bid, please go ahead.
yeah. Please, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mentioned the framework that we can use
Yeah.
to formulate our learning strategy and the ecosystem. Now,
Mm-hmm.
one of the important core components of that framework is our ability to execute. This is where now finally we come into the execution and also scale up effectively. So typically we start with a pilot, we test it, and once we see the impact, then we scale it up. Now, it's very important to measure the impact of that pilot before we just go ahead and scale it up, because although budgets for L&D have increased a lot in recent years and we are no longer fighting for better budgets, it is our ability to execute and scale up effectively which will determine um, L&D budgets in the years to come. Because unless we demonstrate here that the scaling is being done effectively, efficiently, there won't be any proof of the ROI. So, a best practice many organizations use to scale effectively is to go in for external staff augmentation services to support them in their learning initiatives. This way, they can select the specific skill sets that they want for the duration they want without having to add internal resources for which they may not have a budget or even a long term need. So that is one of the aspects, which I found very useful in our ability to scale up effectively. Um, Closely related to, I think I did mention the impact, measuring the impact, and we kind of touched upon it in our
Yeah.
first podcast where we talked about business goals. Now, unless we have clarity on the business goals and clarity on the kind of impact we are hoping to achieve, we can't measure it. So, this is where KPIs play a big role, the key performance
Yeah.
indicators.
Right.
Of course, at a theoretical level, we all know that it's important to measure the impact. So at this, there are different levels at which we can see the KPIs. One is at the level of excellence of the business, which really, begins with ensuring that the L&D function is aligned with the business strategy, with the business goals of the organization. The other is to do with the set of KPIs that relate to learning excellence, which is where we evaluate whether our learners have been able to demonstrate application, a change in behavior. On the job, has it made a tangible difference? And traditionally, we've measured impact at the levels, at Kirkpatrick levels 1 and 2. But there really is a very urgent and compelling need to go beyond it to demonstrate the impact and overall, whatever we have done as a L&D function, that it has contributed to helping the business, to helping our organization meet its business outcomes.
Yeah.
So
I
that,
think
yeah,
measurement is something which is very crucial, as we touched base on the last episode as well. Cannot agree
right.
more to that. But yeah, that's correct.
Now, another aspect, to make sure that we succeed in our learning strategy in the setting up of a robust ecosystem is to make sure that L&D is not only aligned with the business leaders and the business units, but that it is very closely integrated with HR as well.
Oh.
Now, I think we can all recall a time when it was a little more compartmentalized than it is today.
Hmm.
But now there is a more seamless way of working together with HR. And we at L&D, our role has expanded. We play a critical role right from recruitment, designing the onboarding experience, the subsequent skill building, the performance management, the talent management part of it, right down, even to the succession planning and the career progression. So basically, at every step in the learner's engagement or the
Hmm.
employment at a given organization, we have a critical role to play as we work very closely with the HR function. And as I mentioned earlier, we also work with HR to create a learning culture with the active involvement of leaders to drive it. And other ways in which we can help HR play, work with us is in making sure that learners are rewarded and recognized for their learning. And this is something where HR can highlight it, communicate it by way of newsletters, company wide newsletters and town halls, and maybe even highlight key significant learning events. And if there's some change happening in an organization, touch upon which learning interventions really to highlight during this change management phase. And so this is something where, L&D can work very closely with HR and make sure that we can add value to the HR function. We can be valued partners, not just with business unit leaders, but also with HR.
Right. You mentioned L&D needs to be integrated very closely with HR. Creating a vibrant learning culture by partnering with HR is one aspect. But can you share any other example or examples?
Um, Another example that I can share off the top of my head is, uh, L&D working with HR and being a part of their HR agenda. So
Hmm.
let me explain what I mean by this.
Yeah.
When we understand major HR management practices and processes, then we can collaborate closely with HR. For example, when it comes to our annual performance reviews, most learners have the official HR communication on it, but
Hmm.
L&D can partner with HR to ensure that learners are prepared for the HR processes involved by touching on the softer side of the process. For instance, if there is a coaching
Uh-huh.
and performance management that's happening mid-year in a given organization, then L&D can make sure that we roll out something which helps managers have these kind of conversations. We and they learn from each other, so we can set up something where they're not only learning, not only do they know the official HR communication part of it, the HR process part of it, but they're also engaging with each other to share insights and best practices. And also something like preparing for the mid-year and end of year reviews. This is where L&D can help managers uh, ensure that informal feedback is being given all year long so that people are not surprised at the end. So we can do this by building up team sessions with managers, by building focused discussion groups with managers, and making sure that we are partnering with HR to ensure that these HR processes happen very smoothly, and that people are well equipped in terms of what they need to be doing. And L&D can also partner with HR by using high level feedback that comes out of performance reviews, because this kind of feedback that is shared by HR at a very high level. I of course I do understand that we can't have access to confidential information at the learner's level, but there can be high level insights that are shared by HR based on the annual performance appraisals, which can in turn help us in L&D inform our decisions going forward in terms of the kind of learning initiatives we come up with for upskilling and reskilling. So that is
Right.
another thing that we can leverage.
Understood.
Now, I think one essential part of our learning strategy and the overall ecosystem is to enable the 70-20-10 framework. For those of you who are familiar with it, uh, I think we've all been doing this to some degree. The 70-20-10 refers to 70% of learning happening on the job, 20% happening through social or peer learning, and 10% happening through formal training. Now, these are
Okay.
just rough guidelines, and I'm sure the exact percentages vary from organization to organization. But we have also begun to notice, even in our own interactions with our customers, that there is an increasing shift to roll out more formal training. So that has gone up by a huge 10%. So now it's more of 20% of formal training. And what we can do is be constantly on the lookout for opportunities to integrate all of these aspects into the learner's learning journeys, not just the 20% of formal training, but also the social learning and the on the job learning. And there are various channels and formats that we really can leverage, not just the typical VILTs and ILTs, but the e-learnings, the fireside chats, the video based learnings. We can really leverage multiple platforms such as Teams channels and the communities of practice, both inside the organization and outside of it, and set up mentoring and coaching systems in place. And like I mentioned before, be very purposeful about the way we use team meets. Start using them from a learning perspective, and so on.
All right. I just have one question over here. To what extent do you think that the organizations have really leveraged the 70-20-10 framework?
Yeah, Ved. So it really depends organization to organization. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not something carved in stone. The 70-20-10. I think we all
Sure.
deployed in varying degrees. But I think
Okay.
you will agree that we've gone beyond just focusing on the formal training aspect. Now we are
Mm-hmm.
making sure that we integrate the formal training very meaningfully with the on the job learning experiences, which could involve learners monitoring something, analyzing, troubleshooting, conducting experiments, shadowing someone. And
Uh-huh.
as part of the 70-20-10 framework, we can make sure that learning resources are available at the learner's point of need, and that the social aspect, which is really the peer-to-peer learning and the team-based kind of learning, is integrated within the learning journey. And like I mentioned before, we can be more deliberate about enabling learner engagement across multiple channels. Now, the biggest advantage of doing all this is that we are, in a sense, creating continuous learning pathways. And so there are multiple touch points for learners to engage with each other and to engage with mentors or to engage with industry experts. And of course, when it comes to the formal learning aspect of it, we have digital learning in its many avatars. We have ILTs and VLTs being repurposed in the form of e-learnings or digital learnings by dividing them up into relevant pieces, adding the required engagements, interactivities, and assessments, and so on. Um, all of this, when I was talking about all of this, this really brings me to the last point, because there is something which enables all of this, and I think we can all agree that learning technology is really the game changer for the
Right.
training function, without which all of that which I shared here today wouldn't really be possible. So, technology platforms and applications that enable just in time learning, these are just some of the things that every organization is investing in. We have next generation learning management systems, we have virtual classrooms, we have mobile learning apps that also include micro learning apps, which are a significant growing trend. And
Mm-hmm.
we also have these embedded performance support systems, polling softwares, learning video, platforms, assessment platforms, and all of this is possible only with learning technology. And when it comes, to the nitty gritty of getting down into designing and developing our learning experiences, then we have AI, artificial intelligence, and AI based tools, which are now our new best friend. And we will explore the why and how of it in subsequent sessions. And to just bring it all together, the various aspects, the various components of this framework that I talked about today. And
Mm-hmm.
I would like to say that these are the few aspects that we need to keep in mind when formulating our overarching learning strategy and building and nurturing our learning ecosystem. So our success depends on how effectively we integrate all of these into a seamless experience for the learners.
That's great. Thank you, Shalini. This is really a very useful framework, and from all that you have shared, the various pieces of the learning ecosystem and strategy are all interconnected with each component impacting the other. When we tackle it comprehensively, the success of a learning initiative actually goes up. And yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for your time. It's been a great talk, and I look forward to have you again in the future.
Thank you, Ved. My pleasure.
You're welcome. And yes, thank you everyone in the audience for listening to us so patiently. And I hope it was beneficial for you too as well. Please subscribe to our podcast if you haven't yet. And yes, I'll see you in the next one.